So hailing from the eastern hemlock-lined gorges and sandstone waterfalls of the rolling foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. This sounds like the beginning of like a song, like a being Southern Ohio, from Southern Ohio. Crista is mildly eccentric, hominoid with deep adoration. I've not read this yet, so this is very entertaining for me right now. She adores plants, birds, and rocks. Her love of nature and thirst for adventure led her on a path. Some of these words I can't even say. I'm gonna say them wrong, so I just skip past them. Through academia, from studying eco-tour on Andros Island, Bahamas, wow, to serving an internship in the heart of the wild Frank River Church wilderness of no return. That's really cool. With the University of Idaho, to graduating summa cum laude with a master's of botany at the University of Wyoming. Crista found her true calling as a botanist, working for the Forest Service. One of her greatest joys is engaging in outreach and spreading her infectious love of the planet's primary producers. Yay, plants. In her free time, Crista enjoys most time spent with family and amid the mountains and the trees. Sorry, I butchered that a little bit, but
no,
well done.
Thank you. Hi, thank you for coming. I'm pleased to be here to talk to you about this really cool job that I have and to spread the word on how one can go about meeting the eligibility requirements and effort to recruit more botanists. Let's see, so we'll go ahead and slide change. Okay, great. So before beginning, I wanted to acknowledge that the land that we are on is the traditional and unceded territory of the Shoshone, the Bannock, and the Northern Paiute people, and recognize the enduring resilience and connection that Indigenous people maintain with the land. Pictured here is Sacagawea's bitterroot, a rare endemic of the central Idaho mountains. For today's talk, here's a roadmap. We're going to start with an introduction and background about why I'm driven to do this today and share a little bit about myself. Dive into some relevant law and policy that's really important to understand the ins and outs of jobs as a botanist or any natural resource specialist in land management. And then go into the elements of the position, broken down into 3 categories. And then I will talk about how to meet the eligibility requirements and give some examples. And then lastly, I'll go over conclusions and open the floor for any questions that you may have. So starting with introduction and background. Why present? I really like this graphic. I feel like we can all relate. Success is no linear path by any means. I'd like to say that mine was especially creative. However, I ended up dropping out of high school and having some really tough times as an adolescent and never really aspired to go to college. So I like to think that I'm statistics, but I like to also spread the word because it's possible for anybody to overcome adversity and really chase your dreams. So I went through a lot of circuitous academic endeavors, I guess you could say. I didn't know that a job as a botanist was a possibility when I was young, or even when I was an undergrad. I think it's really clicked. I found and met somebody with the Forest Service and understood botanist as an occupation interfacing with the herbaria. So I was really excited when I found this niche, and it was the first thing in my life that just clicked. It's like, oh yeah, this is what I want to do. But there was years of listlessness, as I describe here, that preceded that, and especially after those rough years of being a high school dropout and getting a good enough diploma. But I do like to highlight this in a sense of humility and also inspiration to others, because I think no matter what adversity we face, you can move past it, you know? And I like to always say the world needs more botanists. Unfortunately, something happening is a declining of representation in academia and in essence in the job force as well. So we're losing botanists, we're losing academic courses that talk about taxonomy and systematics and the natural history of the world. So I think it's really important to shed light on this as a career path and spread the word, let people know. So today's talk is going to be specific to the content of what it is to be a Forest Service botanist and eligibility requirements. There are a lot of changes in the agency that I'm employed by right now, and I'm not going to be broaching any questions or topics pertaining to those changes, but I do have business cards to our chief, what is he called? His job title is Public Information Officer, and Mike is his name. He's very happy to field any questions you have pertaining to other content. I'll stick to the botany stuff, so. Furthermore, I just want to share that this is my experience as a botanist on my unit. So it is variable, and it's based a lot on the local unit, your supervisor, the district ranger, the forest supervisor. So what I represent here may be true for me, but it may not be true for other botanists across regions or other units, other forests across the United States. So before diving into the nitty-gritty, it's important to first understand relevant law and policy, which informs natural resource management related to natural resources. These following policies shape federal land management and make it possible for me to carry out my function as a botanist. This is by no means a comprehensive list. It's just select foundational legislation that's been critical to understanding the policies that inform management today. So first we start with the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act, signed into law by Eisenhower in 1960. Let me get my clicking down. This was the first law to define and enact the 5 major uses of national forest, being timber, range, water, recreation, and wildlife. The impetus being balancing these resources to meet the present and the future needs of generations. This law is central to the mission of not only the Forest Service, but the BLM. So federal land management is founded on an understanding of multiple use, sustained yield. And this is also an inherent source of what some call dynamic tension duality, which can make jobs really interesting in this sector. A decade later, Nixon signed into law the National Environmental Protection Act of 1970, otherwise known as NEPA. With NEPA, Congress mandated that federal agencies take a hard look, as it was dubbed, at the environmental consequences of their actions to engage all practical measures to prevent environmental harm when engaging in any of the actions the agency undertook. Presented here is a simplified schematic of the NEPA process. There are 3 levels of impact in terms of the review process, and I'm not going to go into full detail about those today or the changes therein. But they are categorical exclusions, environmental assessments, and finally, an environmental impact statement. And those are typically anticipated to be commensurate with the level of impact anticipated. So the level of environmental harm that may occur from a federal action. However, no matter what level of review, whether it's a CE, an EA, or an EIS, if there are possible impacts to sensitive species or those that are at risk or special status, we need to undergo a review process, whether it's a biological evaluation for sensitive species or a biological assessment for those that are listed under the Endangered Species Act. And we'll get into more about those in a bit. So the legislation that's arguably heralding the greatest change in terms of conservation for at-risk species was the Endangered Species Act of 1973, signed into law by Nixon. So here we have a critical legislation aimed specifically at preventing extinction. I found a quote by a historian named Kevin Starr, and he said the Endangered Species Act of 1973 is the Magna Carta of environmental movement. And what this means is that Section A2 defines that the Act requires federal agencies to ensure that their actions do not jeopardize listed species or adversely modify critical habitat. Federal agencies, which are referred to as action agencies in this legislation, must consult with the Secretary of the Interior before taking any actions which may affect listed species. I found it interesting in my research that after the wave of animal listing subsided, so it was enacted in 1973, the first plant was listed in 1977. So it took some time to get some attention. I guess that's not surprising. I had a botany teacher, Pam Brunsfeld, tell me it's called green blindness, and I see it all the time. I try to overcome it, teach people. But anyway, so we had 1977, the first plant was listed. And pictured here is not actually the first plant was listed, but this was the first plant that was recovered. And this is called Potentilla, is it Robinsiana? Yes. Yes, Barbara. It was a listed plant. It's endemic to the White Mountains of New Hampshire. It's called Robin's cinquefoil. And it was in decline due to trampling, over collection. People wanted it for their garden. It was in a popular route for the Appalachian Trail. So this plant was listed, and due to the collaboration between U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the United States Forest Service, the New England Wildflower Society, and the Appalachian Mountain Club, representing the recreationists, this plant was recovered and is now sustaining out there. So a nice success story. 3 years after this ESA was enacted came the National Forest Management Act, signed into law by President Ford. This was a landmark legislation mandating that comprehensive interdisciplinary land management plans for forests and grasslands must occur. This is sort of the backbone of a lot of what we do in terms of law and policy. And with the advent of NIFMA, as we dub it in the Forest Service, National Forest Management Act, NIFMA, the Forest Service was required to develop these plans. And through this legislation, it was also mandated that regular reports analyze the status and trends of the nation's renewable resources. These are actually publicly available assessments that are conducted on a 10-year basis, with the most recent completed in 2020. Under this act, national directives were also established, and they specifically, what I call out here was the Forest Manual, the Forest Service Manual, or FSM. This lays the groundwork and policy for sensitive species management. So here's actually a screenshot from the Forest Service Manual as it pertains to sensitive species. And these are requirements of our agency in dealing with species. What I highlighted here, and what is important to understand, is that the line officer is the deciding official in the Forest Service realm. It is not myself. It is not another specialist. It is actually the district ranger or the forest supervisor who has the authority to make decisions on the ground. I'm simply somebody who recommends, based on my specialty or expertise, actions to take or mitigations to follow management decisions. But as you can see here, there are statutes that require us to make sure that species don't become listed. So to manage those sensitive species in perpetuity so that our actions don't lead to their federal listing. And there's also a lot of cooperation to call for other agencies like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who we consult with for those ESA species. Lastly, the Forest Management Act came what we call the planning rules. And there's been various renditions of the planning rules. And right now, the agency is transitioning from the regional forest or sensitive species model to a species of conservation concern model. And that update will take place with the 2012 planning rule. However, many units are still operating under the 1982 planning rule, including the one that I am currently employed by. So I am not going to cover species of conservation concern in this talk. My talk will focus on the management that is now in place in the forest that I'm employed with, which is operating under our 2010 Forest Management Plan, and that operates under the 1982 planning rule. So if you were at the Rare Plant Conference, though, Samantha gave a great talk on species of conservation concern, but I will not be broaching that topic today. So this leads us to the Forest Service. And this mission is predicated on the principles of responsible land management, balancing the sustainable multi-use management of public lands with the needs of the people. To do that, it takes a village and a suite of specialized skill sets. Enter the specialist. A Forest Service botanist is the person designated as a subject matter expert to recommend, emphasis on recommend, management decisions related to botanical resources, be it at-risk species, conservation concern, be it non-native, invasive, or native plant communities. By the way, I used AI to generate this image. I have only flirted with the use of AI, but I had a little bit of fun creating these images. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean I get to frolic around the mountains looking at wildflowers and ferns all the livelong day. This was a fun one to toy around with AI. I even got the rocks on the desk after a few attempts. But anyway, to comply with the various laws and policies, the job requires a lot of desk time. There's reporting, there's a lot of writing, there's a lot of environmental compliance that must happen. So it is not all field fun, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So for the next portion of the presentation, I will break down the elements of a Forest Service botanist by category, and I'll start with project planning and implementation, move into program management, and finally, the outreach and collaboration. Again, the caveat is this is a breakdown of my workload now. And actually last week I was like, I should update this because there was a project that was like, oh, by the way, this is happening. So do the field work. So 80% of the work that I'm tasked with is related to planning and implementation. For example, these could include vegetation management projects, minerals extraction, restoration projects, and it also includes the wildfire response duties that are ancillary to my primary position. And I'll go into those a little bit more in a few slides from now. 15% is dedicated to the program management. That includes inventory and monitoring, database management, continuing education. And then lastly, 5% is dedicated to outreach. This myself, I'm in an outreach right now. So this is representing that 5%. And that waxes and wanes based on opportunities and also the workload that I'm under. So we'll start with project planning. The project planning process can be broken down into phases. The initiation or development phase is when a proponent or a project lead works with that line officer, the deciding official, to develop a project based on needs that are identified, and those can be influenced from a national level, a regional level, or locally. And then we work with the collaboration of the interdisciplinary team as necessary to define that proposed action. That does not always occur in this phase. The next stage is the NIFMA, that National Forest Management Act phase. So this is usually when the interdisciplinary team, which is comprised of a botanist, usually, a hydrologist, wildlife biologist, a silviculturist, a timber management specialist, you name it. We have recreation program managers that are really influential in this process of interdisciplinary teamwork. It is really kind of a interesting interpersonal exercise. And it's influenced a lot by personalities, and leadership is really important in this part, you know, making sure that cohesion moves forward, the expectations are delineated ahead of time. But sometimes there's friction, and that's just inherent in this type of work. This is also the stage when those specialists come up with design features to mitigate impacts to their specific resource that they're tasked with being the expert of. This is when we conduct project surveys, and that could even be ground truthing for the proposed action itself. Where are we going to put a skid trail? Where are we going to put that landing? And that will help inform, as I'll get to in a moment, the surveys and prioritizing the survey areas specific to our resources. And for me, that's botany and rare plants. The final phase is somewhat of the illustration a couple slides ago where I'm at a computer working on reporting. And honestly, it's not that bad. I don't mind the writing. It's an important piece of what we do. We need to document impacts, and we need to work through analytically, what are those effects? What are potential indirect effects of an action that we aren't thinking of? And that's the process we really get to break down the nitty gritty. And when some design features can actually be born out of that process as well. Yes, I make a note here because I don't know if you've heard of condition-based management, but it follows a different trajectory. And I'm not necessarily getting into that today, but I'm happy to answer any questions as it relates to botany regarding condition-based management projects. But just a note, it does follow different trajectories than the one outlined here. So specific to botanical resources, that's what it's dubbed in the working. So it's like hydrologic resources, wildlife resources, botanical resources. So if I sound like I'm programmed in a sense of utilitarianism, it's just the way that I refer to it in the circles that I run in. So today, for all intents and purposes, botanical resources is the rare plants, the native communities, and the new invaders that are going to cause ecological unrest. So this is the phase where we break it down into processes of pre-field review, ecological risk assessment, the field surveys, if they're needed, which is determined by the former two processes, And then finally, the effects analysis, where we're going to actually document the biological evaluation of effects. So these biological and ecological risks to at-risk species are determined by a professional evaluation of the pre-field review to inform the likelihood that the proposed activities will impact species at risk and the potential consequences of those actions to the species at risk. So to inform this process, to facilitate this process, we have a risk assessment matrix. And this helps us understand the consequences, the likelihood of impact, and therefore where we need to prioritize survey areas. Often comprehensive survey coverage across large areas, which these are 3,000-acre projects or more in some cases. It's a large area and it's not feasible to cover entire areas of ground survey-wise. So we need to prioritize our efforts. And to do that, we use some really useful tools, especially those in the geospatial realm. We have remote sensing, LiDAR, aerial imagery, models. So taking information that was sourced from remotely sensed data and extrapolating where we think a species is likely to occur based on those inputs. And that can be really time intensive, and this process is not easy. So it's really difficult off the cuff to just jump into the field season when you have a project that's just been handed to you in the midst of anthesis or flowering. So it is nice to have time to prepare, to target our surveys, to prioritize across large areas where there's going to be disturbance. This process helps us do just that. Areas I emphasize here that get a little bit more damage on the ground, so to speak, in terms of soil disturbance, are targeted and often intersected with areas that we identify as suitable habitats for the species that we're considering, those at-risk species within an area. We also revisit known populations of rare plants and at-risk species, otherwise known as element occurrences, to ensure that in those affected areas, there's any status, condition, threats, or the potential for impacts from the action. So we have that kind of data to support our effects analysis. We need to get some important baseline data from those populations. So to help outline and enhance understanding, I slapped an example on the slide here. This is not a species that we have in the Boise National Forest, but it is one that I hold near and dear to my heart. Clustered lady slipper, Cypripedium fasciculatum, or CIFA, as I'll call it henceforth, is a rare orchid that's often associated with mixed conifer stands with a moderately open understory. Let's consider some impact potential. So some projects have a likelihood of impacting the species, including commercial harvest, where we're changing the overstory composition. So the amount of canopy that's impeding the direct flow of light can alter the habitat and make it unsuitable. Also fire. So a low severity or intensity burn may actually be beneficial by reducing competition and resulting in a pulse of nutrients into that soil system. High intensity, however, could completely remove the species due to lethal soil temperatures and root mortality. So let's go through a couple scenarios with potential projects. So say we have a project area that has a known or a very high likelihood of occurrence of CIFA. However, the proposed treatments within that area may have a low impact. Let's say that those proposed treatments included low intensity burns. So during inopportune times for high intensity burns, so shoulder season burns, where we know the vegetation is going to be rich with moisture and that intensity won't get high. Or we have some partial hand thinning. So by way of chainsaw, people are going and felling trees very selectively and in a way that creates a mosaic, and we're not reducing that overall canopy cover immensely. One could conclude these consequences would be lower. So in that scenario, you may need surveys, but you may have to say, hey, I've got to prioritize elsewhere. I have a known occurrence or I have a known high potential habitat. Let's enact a mitigation measure and have an avoidance of that area. Okay, moving on. Another scenario where we definitely want to prioritize surveys, we have a known or high likelihood of occurrence and a high impact. So we're in that 4 category, high likelihood, high consequences. So we have a commercial treatment. They're going to be out there with heavy machinery. We know that they're going to alter the canopy. there's going to be more light radiating into the understory, and or high fire severity. So in that case, we will need to be surveying in the areas that intersect those areas of high disturbance, just to make sure we have a keen understanding of the species distribution so that we can enact those mitigation measures so that there will be no impacts or they will be mitigated. So this information from the pre-field and the risk assessment is used to determine the survey needs and then the levels of those surveys. I'm not going to go into too much details about the various kinds or the levels of surveys that we do. I'm happy to field those questions at another time, but suffice it to say, this will inform the process that we go into to identify priority areas of survey. And then we go out, and this will also inform our biological assessment. One of the things I wanted to point out here, though, is that we have species that operate under some really fickle time constraints, I guess you could say. The first picture was Sacagawea's bitterroot, which is an ephemeral species on the landscape. It comes up, it emerges, no more than 5 weeks, it can be present, and altogether above ground, it disappears. You wouldn't know it's there. It's amazing and frustrating at times as well. So, and it's very dependent upon environmental conditions. So from one year to the next, it can undergo prolonged dormancy and you may not even see it, or its numbers may be reduced. So it's really important to consider those limitations when identifying survey areas, is making sure your timing is appropriate and that you are on target in terms of its phenology, its active window. Here, I just wanted to highlight some examples because pictures are pretty. Over here, we had a project where there was a proposal for a climbing special use permit, and we went out and surveyed the area to determine whether or not there were any species of concern that would be damaged by climbing or inserting anchors, you name it. In the middle, here's a site where we were large-scale vegetation management project. And within the project boundary, which was rather large, I came upon, in monitoring, came upon a scene where some folks had decided to fell a tree within an occupied Sacagawea's bitterroot habitat and brought, I guess you could say, their motorcycles up onto. So this was a case where I was out there documenting for baseline conditions and understanding of mitigations we need to place that site. And here we have a former seasonal employee. We were coming upon a site where dwarf Idaho primrose occurs and trying to understand the best way to ascend into that very remote stretch. Beautiful area out there. Trying to think of the summit. I can't recall. And then below we have in the Boise front out just surveying some known populations and potential habitat that had been unsurveyed, just trying to understand better this distribution of a rare plant in the Boise front. So all this time I've been mentioning mostly about those species of concern, but what about non-native invasive species? This is actually something that we are considering, especially in that ecological risk assessment stage. We do have some data in our corporate database that tells us what species may be there, but that data set is not always complete. Staffing levels can be challenging and it's a little bit archaic. So it's important that when we're out surveying, that we are also recording and inventorying all the species we encounter, but especially those that could pose a threat ecologically, especially with the way of disturbance and spread. I did like to share that I wrote, did you know that some forest or grasslands would join invasive management under the purview of botany? So I think that is important because it's not always consistent across the board. Some forests actually lump their invasives program under the botany, whereas others, like the Boise National Forest, actually puts it under the purview of the rangeland program. So a program that is pretty hefty to manage in and of itself is often a all hands on deck approach. So we definitely include those in our botany surveys and document those and confer a lot with the people that are tasked with managing those weeds, going out and spraying them. And we rely a lot on partners, especially lately, to get a lot of that work done. But I did want to make a plug at this point. The ones highlighted here are what we're deeming like new invaders, and they're not ones that are widely distributed across the Boise National Forest. So if you happen to see any pot catches of these or infestations, please don't hesitate to reach out. All hands on deck. And we really need everybody's eyes out there because our staffing levels right now are not sufficient for us to have a lot of reconnaissance on the ground. So you're all out and about. If you see infestations that you think warrant triaging, or you just want to let us know, it's no trouble. Please reach out to myself, or even the Boise National Forest hotline. Like if you Google it, they'll get you in touch with the right people. Okay, this is where the text gets a little wordy. The slides get wordy, but I figured that's only suitable because it's talking about effects analysis. And this is the reporting part where there's a lot of words. I did want to pull from the Forest Service manual. There are 7 standards of biological evaluations that are required of us. So when we're going through a process and we're documenting effects, these 7 standards should be included in every document that we procure. And this basically tells you that we're making sure we're talking to our partners in the case of listed species. We have a description of all occupied and unoccupied habitat. So we've done our due diligence. Is there rare plants out there? Is there habitat out there? Have we analyzed the effects of our action on those species? Will there be loss of viability? These are all things that we need to explore in these reports that we're documenting effects analysis. Then we come to an effect determination. So through that process, we reach a no effect, a beneficial effect, or a may effect. And then recommendations for removing, avoiding, or compensating for any adverse effects. That's what we dub design features, design elements, in some cases, mitigation measures. And then, of course, you gotta have your reference page. I just wanted to include an example up here, just so you can understand a recent document related to vegetation management. I'm not going to read every word, but I did just want to include it to show you an example of how we document the baseline conditions. So on the left is an excerpt from a rare plant population that was discovered within an activity area where they had actions planned, where there was going to be ground disturbance. And by way of survey, we discovered this population of penstemon laxus, or tufted penstemon, and also called Idaho beard tongue, depending on who you talk to. And we just include this in the report. So I'm talking about communities that was surrounding, which I thought were pretty incredible. There's Clematis versatisima, Trillium petiolatum, Penstemon laxus, and Wyethicilianthoides. It was a really cool place. Anyway, I digress. So in this process, so the pre-field review, we went out and surveyed these potential habitats, these aspen stands, and then we came up with design features to mitigate impacts to that population. And so in that effects analysis, you can see the mechanical thinning treatments section incorporates the mitigation and says that this is going to decrease the impact. So we don't expect the impact to be significant based on this avoidance. And here's the lengthy design feature, which basically is an avoidance area buffered, depending on the activity, up to 300 feet. I'm sorry, meters. That always bothers people when I use meters, but I don't know. I think that I got groomed with academia to do that. Anyway, 300 meters, depending on the activity, there will be mitigations, and that's built into the design of the project. So just an example of that. Okay, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time distinguishing the difference between a biological evaluation or a biological assessment. If you're interested, you can follow up with me. But essentially, suffice it to say that for species that are listed with the Endangered Species Act, we're going to compose a different document, a whole separate document, and that's going to be sent off to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and they're going to review it and come back with their own official document called a biological opinion, saying, yes, we agree, or no, that's not going to happen. And all of this is in an effort to determine, will this action jeopardize this really sensitive species that's listed with the Endangered Species Act? And as far as plants go, the only one on our forest that we consider is whitebark pine. We do have Lepidium pepliferum, but no critical habitat, but it comes up on the list when we query the website. And we don't have any designated critical habitat on our forest. So the only plant that we consider in the Endangered Species Act category is the whitebark pine, which is pictured here. This is a really large tree up in the Trinities. And here's a Forest Service personnel. This is what's called an anti-aggregate pheromone he's applying to the tree to help dissipate beetles. This is an important stand up there that's exhibiting genetic resistance to a non-native pathogen. Anyway, so that's consultation in a nutshell. Okay, so next section is the implementation. And I broke it down into restoration and recovery, coordination, and then implementation monitoring. One of the cool parts of the job is when you're cruising around, you're out surveying, you're taking in all this data and you're taking in all of these information on systems that you're observing, ecological communities. And we do have the latitude to recommended sites for habitat improvement, to incorporate those in the proposed actions, the vegetation management, what have you. And depending on the deciding official, they may or may not incorporate it, but that's largely contingent upon priorities, and those can change. But it is one of the cool parts of the job is being able to supply that feedback and input. We also do planting and seeding projects, which are probably the most thrilling thing that I can think of. We just had an event last Friday where we planted a bunch of willow with one of our partners, the volunteer group Trout Unlimited. And this planting effort was to help minimize sedimentation into the South Fork Boise River, which is really important for the ESA listed bull trout. So we do a lot of partnership planting and then post-fire restoration. So I think it was a few months ago, Jessica Irwin, who's a fellow botanist with the Forest Service, gave a presentation on her work doing some non-forested restoration and revegetation work in the fire scars of the lava and the Nelly fire. That's another example of some cool things that we get to do. And if you didn't check out that talk, I highly recommend it. It's wonderful. Some really cool work happening out there. We also coordinate collection of desired species for grow out or direct seeding. Recently, in the recent years, I'd say, gosh, 4 years, 5 years maybe, we've been working with Idaho Fish and Game, and we're issuing pretty much a free use collection permit. So they're collecting mountain big sagebrush to further their restoration efforts across boundaries. And we have some really great stands of mountain big sagebrush. So Fish and Game comes out with their entire team of volunteers and collects a bunch of seeds, which are usually grown out at the nursery and then planted. In the case of the Valley Fire, which happened a couple years back, the seeds were sown directly. And it was really neat that we got to donate back a portion of the seeds that we got in return to that effort, even though it wasn't on Forest Service grounds. So it's a really cool cross-boundary partnership with state and federal agencies. We're also cooperative in the National Native Seed Strategy, of course, and I'm not going to go into too much detail about what that is, but again, if you have any questions, please follow up. But we have had interns come out, identify viable seed populations of really important pollinator species, forbs, grasses also, to help with restoration efforts across federal lands. And that was born out of some legislation a few years back. Really important is the work that we do in terms of the post-fire or post-disturbance erosion control seeding. So as mentioned, a lot of the activities that we engage in can be really impactful on the ground. And the sun is just really reminding.
We're trying to figure it out.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
There you go.
But we never. Yeah.
So things like landings or skid trails, minerals excavation projects, these are all things that have marks and leave on the landscape. And so it's really important for us to stabilize the soils in the wake of disturbance. And we try to do that in the best way possible with suitable species. Those species are often, oh.
Just locked us in.
We don't know what we're doing.
That's, I think the sun is setting, we're good. Anyway, these species are largely workhorse grass species. So species that are going to mobilize quickly and, this is not construction. Anyway, so typical projects that implement this, we're often prescribing these mixes. Now, these projects are often implemented with contracts. So the contractor is going to the commercial seed industry with these prescriptions and designations about critical non-weeds. So we have certified noxious weed-free requirements, and we also have certifications on species like viability. So is the seed actually going to germinate? Is it certified pure life seed? So we have some specs in there that are required of contractors when they're out doing this type of work. And that's part of the job too. We try to work in as much as possible pollinator-friendly forbs as they're available, but largely across the commercial seed market, the cost can be burdensome to contractors. So the grasses do typically tend to be the predominant species in the mix. But we prescribe mixes that are native as far as possible, and sometimes we also include cultivars because that's what's commercially available. One of the most important parts, I think, is, I'll go right here. I can't. It's spanning or bridging the gap between planning and implementation. So we go through all these projects and renditions, and we're in interdisciplinary teams, making these conversations and coming up with mitigation. But then you have a completely different crew of people that are actually implementing on the ground. So sometimes there's a possibility that information is lost between them. So we have some really great, I guess, mechanisms in place on our forest where we have these annual meetings, and they're long meetings going through project by project, and each specialist is coming up. Hey, this is a design feature you need to make sure to incorporate in the contract, or if it's played out on the landscape. So it's a really important part of the implementation is actually working with them on that group or individual basis, even at times. And then monitoring. So pictured here is actually an underground fiber optic cable installation that occurred on the Mountain Home Ranger District. And when we got information about their plans to install this, we went out and surveyed, and we found several rare plant populations. It was a really cool site, so we wanted to make sure that we had really good contingencies in place. So I got to learn about horizontal drilling, which was fascinating. And that technology was utilized to usurp this rare plant population, which actually occurred in the right of way of the road. So it was a really exciting thing to be a part of, but we often want to, especially when it's carried out by a third party or another entity, be there to have some oversight to ensure that the implementation is actually following through with those buffers. Okay, I mentioned earlier, there's other opportunities that are ancillary to the position. So what I'm mentioning here isn't in my position description, but as a federal employee, there are opportunities that exist. I'll just go through a few of them. And these are really exciting ways to contribute to land management and to help with emergency response. Resource advisor is a trained specialist who works with the agency administrator to mitigate impacts, to identify, protect, and rehabilitate natural and cultural resources during incidents. So walking a planned route for a dozer line to make sure there's no rare plants or cultural artifacts, things of that nature as an example. That's what a resource advisor or a reef or READ, as they're dubbed, does. They are conferring with the ops people to make sure that all the stuff they do, to the extent practicable, because obviously health and human safety is priority number one. But they are people out there that are trying to mitigate the impacts on the landscape while also accomplishing environment suppression. And then post-fire environment. This is a really important specialist opportunity. And these have all the trainings and qualifications too. So there's additional courses that one can take to be certified or qualified to do this work. But a burned area emergency response specialist is usually a scientist or an engineer who assesses the post-wildfire conditions to identify imminent threats to life, property, natural, and cultural resources. So when I go out and do this, I'm doing it as a botany and a weed specialist. That's what I'm done. That's my shop. We have engineers that are going out and looking at, is this culvert going to be plugged because this high severity fire went through and nothing's going to stabilize the soil? So it's a group of specialists that are coming together, and rapid assessment is intense of a site to see what's going to happen and what's happening soon. So in this picture here is out with a colleague, and we were in the Nelly fire assessing the burn severity and considering what was it? It was a noxious weed that we don't have too abundant in that neck of the woods. Dalmatian toadflax. And the dozer work went through the Dalmatian toadflax. So we're documenting that and describing the vector potential is high. So there's going to be a potential that this is going to be a new infestation that's spread across this, 15-mile dozer line. So going out, documenting things like that and post-fire mitigating those impacts. And then lastly, the final two, we can go out as a prescribed fire crew member. This is a training that is pretty exciting to get under your belt. It is really tough work. So I've only done that a couple of times. I got to go help with prescribed fire on a landscape and whew, that was intense. But it was also really neat to see firsthand the effects of fire while it's happening, while combustion is occurring. Like ceanothus, a flame, can change and be very variable from one season to the next. I learned that firsthand on the ground. Lastly, there's all sorts of fire trainings that the fire personnel must go through. One of them, in order to get a prescribed fire crew boss attainment, they have to get the RX 310 certification, which is Introduction to Fire Effects. And it's a pretty rigorous course that goes through different resource considerations related to fire effects. And understanding fire behavior is inextricably linked to the vegetation, right? And the time of year, weather, things like that. But serving as a subject matter expert in that cohort has been really, really fun and scratched my itch to teach and spread my love for botany. So that's been an interesting part of serving in a different capacity across the fire world. So next I'm going to go into the program management. I'm not going to keep this up for long, it's a lot of words, but it's an excerpt from our forest plan. And there's different goals and objectives in our forest plan related to each discipline. And I just wanted to shed light on the narrative up top. So this is from our forest plan. It says that we have goals to generally contribute to the survival and recovery and prevent listing of region 4 species. Population of non-native plants are reduced or eradicated in those rare plant populations. Desired habitat conditions are remained, and human activity or levels maintained desired. And a lot of the emphasis is on rare plants. So we're considering those resources in our forest plan. And from a program management perspective, we tier often to this, the goals, the standards, the objectives in our forest plan, which are predicated on that National Forest Management Act and ensuring the viability of species are retained. But there's also some really interesting fun things in here too. I guess if you ever get bored, read through the forest plan, but it's something that guides the work that we do from a program management perspective. Monitoring. So revisits and monitoring of at-risk plant populations are absolutely critical to evaluating the threats and informing management intervention to prevent that loss of population and viability. So we do various kinds of monitoring. However, it's very time constrained. So there are various ways that we can go about monitoring across the landscape, but what we often tier to are the first 3 bullets, that being photo point, presence absence, and population census. I wanted to make a plug today for those of you that may be retired and looking to do other rigorous data things on the landscape. We are honestly, I think, in some need to evaluate deeper a little bit more of those survey and trend data. So doing point intercept, line intercept plots, nest frequency at some of our rare plant populations. So if you have an interest in that and you have skills, qualifications, and would love to contribute to that, please follow up with me because we could use that kind of volunteer workforce in our monitoring program, especially with staffing levels and some of the priorities that we have on us right now in terms of active management. Okay, so this is an abbreviated summary of continuing education, but I just wanted to pop up here a couple of aspects of program management, just staying up to date on the latest and greatest. As we all know, taxonomy can change. That's one thing to stay aware of and apprised with. And new species are described. So I slapped up here Barbara Erder's new pyracoma that she recently described, and working through those that affect the area that we're in. So there could be these species occurrences. Was it Pyracoma boisiana could occur on the Boise. So we're now aware of that and staying privy to that knowledge. That's important that we track that species because it's been identified as one that's at risk. And also related to non-native. So there was a publication a couple of years ago identifying forecasted areas where Vitinata dubia is anticipated to grow and become a problem and act kind of like cheatgrass in that it's creating alterations in the fuel and fire regimes. So we stay up to date on that, technology, training, you name it. And then our corporate database is actually undergoing an overhaul. So that's a really great thing because it's a little archaic. You can see here it's a screenshot, but we have our own reporting database where we're recording our surveys, the surveys themselves, so we can understand where we've been, and the data that was collected from those surveys. The rare plant populations, otherwise known as element occurrences, are also populated in this database, which is a geospatial database. And then non-natives, and then the treatment for those non-natives. I won't go into more detail, but that's an example of a survey and the parameters that the surveyor was evaluating. Botanical collection requests often come in, and those can be from the commercial sector. They can be from research or academia. But as a botanist, we are tasked with evaluating those collections in terms of viability and with respect to overcollection. So we do get a lot of requests, especially the past few years, for commercial seed use. And so we go through and we evaluate the sites, ensure that there's no species of concern or other resource considerations. So wildlife may want to take a look. Is it in sage grouse habitat? You know, where are they going to collect? How are they going to collect? What are the tools? Some folks use a tennis racket and a big giant gallon drum to collect bitter brush. I guess it works. But is that having an impact over years? So we have to assess those things and the conservation of multiple use across the land. And then I mentioned already the partnership with Idaho Fish and Game. So that's a nice example. And pictured here is the Lucky Peak Nursery, where a lot of their sagebrush is grown out locally. Next, I wanted to touch on the categories of the at-risk species. I've mentioned a little bit about endangered species, how whitebark pine is the sole species that we consider. And we have regional forester sensitive species, and those are designated by the regional forester. And then two other categories, which for all intents and purposes are virtually the same, but in our forest plan, the forest watch category was described. But you can see here from the description that they're essentially the same as those that are identified by the Idaho Natural Heritage Program. So we just haven't updated our list in a few years, but we consider any species that has been identified by the Idaho Natural Heritage Program as an S1, S2, and often S3 for tracking and management purposes. And pictured here, some much loved favorites, five-fingered chicken sage, scalloped moonwort, and bugleg golden weed. All really great rare species we have on the Boise. So a note on pollinators. As you may be aware, some pollinators are being proposed for listing, whether threatened or endangered. And we have some loss of pollinator concerns, obviously. So we do manage those on the forest. However, they're under the purview of the Wildlife Management Program. And we work closely with them as their analysis will often tier to ours as we're evaluating botanical resources. They're evaluating pollinators. They're kind of inextricably linked, so we can't really parse that out. So it's a team approach, but it is something that's documented on their end of things. So they're evaluating lynx and they're also evaluating bumblebee. Kind of neat. We have in recent years undergone a detection and monitoring program in partnership with the Bumblebee Atlas, which if you're not aware of, I recommend checking it out. It's a really cool program that is partner driven, but we don't have like taxonomic expertise in bumblebee identification locally. That is some pretty technical skills to possess. So the Bumblebee Atlas allows us to go in and actually document in a rigorous photographic way through ice and cooling and Terper the bumblebees. And then we send that information in and they either confirm or they actually identify what species the bumblebee is. And then we have a record that's not only interchange with our corporate database and used in these management, but also with the world at large, so to speak. So the natural resource community, the Idaho Natural Heritage Database, it all is interfacing. So it's a really cool thing that we're doing on the forest and increasing our understanding of the abundance of some of these rare species. We've recently had several hits of Western bumblebee. This one here, incidentally, I was excusing myself from a team meeting in the woods, and I was like, oh, look at this pretty rose. And then here comes a Western bumblebee. I'm like, oh, it's a sensitive species. Yay. But I got to upload this and incorporate it into the bumblebee atlas, and it's helping us understand this species presence across the landscape. And then I just made a note about how when we're considering effects analysis, we're always considering pollinators because they're inextricably linked, right? We obviously know that there's no parsing that out. And an example I use is a haul route increases the amount of fugitive dust on the landscape. And that can clog the breathing receptacle that an insect has, thereby affecting the plant by possibly decreasing fecundity. So these are things that we're thinking through, both direct and indirect impacts to those at-risk plant communities. Perhaps one of my most favorite components of the job is outreach and environmental ed. I especially love working with the youth and the adolescent groups. Because like I said, I didn't really understand that this was a job opportunity. And I think the earlier exposure would have rerouted my life, but I have no regrets whatsoever. But I think it's important that people understand that this is a possible way to spend your life. Natural resources in general, land management. You can come out here and be a steward of the land, so to speak. So I like to raise awareness and also teach people about the importance of spreading weeds, why to plant native plants in your garden and stop watering endlessly, non-native things. Anyway, I digress again. We have a lot of events where we partner with schools, and we have planting events I mentioned before, and then opportunities for job shadowing. And then I do want to make a plug. I was told by a colleague a few years back about a program called Letters to a Pre-Scientist, and it's actually really cool. You get to be the pen pal of kids that are in underprivileged remote areas and who may have no exposure or, I guess, enthusiasm about science. So the intent is to send letters and whet their appetite and let them understand there's various career paths in the world and to inspire them. Check it out. It's pretty cool. Whether you're in your career or retired, I think it would be a really cool thing to do. And enrollments towards the beginning of the school year. So starting next spring or next fall, rather. So I mentioned the Idaho Natural Heritage Program, and I wanted to follow up with the Southern Idaho Rare Plant Working Group. That's a big part of the outreach that we actively try to engage in as Forest Service botanists. It's a really important place to interface about things that we see on the landscape, monitoring we've done, sharing information, also to glean insight from people that are evaluating species and understand any trends that we need to track. And so that's an important outreach. North Zone botanist Elle and I, a couple of years ago, were co-chairs to the Idaho Rare Plant Conference. That was definitely a huge endeavor and something that was really also very rewarding, but that was in conjunction with this professional outreach facet of my job. So I was happy to be able to do that and have my supervisor's support in that. We brought Dr. Hannah Marks from Cornell now to talk about her really important work over in the Sawtooth Mountains. I think it was the Sawtooth. Anyway, and then lastly, some really cool stuff, just partnering with academia. So there's a couple gentlemen that are looking at describing a new species of erythronium, believe it or not. And they reached out to us after finding some intel on iNaturalist about this novel white-flowered erythronium in Idaho, in the Idaho batholith. So last year, I got to go out with Don Mansfield and collect this beautiful plant over at Lava Mountain on the Mountain Home Ranger District. Really cool area. But that was a nice part of the professional outreach and something I wanted to highlight here. For sake of time, I'm not going to go over the picture. I'm just going to leave you guys wondering why everybody has hazmat on in that one. Okay, so now to the talk, we're going to showcase how to qualify. So this is a professional series. There are eligibility requirements. And that's something that I wish I had known going into my undergraduate degree. It is important that you have at least 24 semester hours in botany. And that can be described as, and this is from the OPM website, botany, plant anatomy, morphology, cytology, histology, genetics, taxonomy or systematics, algology, mycology, ethnobotany. And here's where I really want to emphasize. Those dealing with specific problems of a botanical nature or with specific groups of plants. A word of caution. If you have a class that you are intending to qualify towards the 24 credits, I highly recommend that you have a synopsis or some sort of description at the ready, if not submitted. And I'll show you an example that I recommend. The folks that are evaluating these eligibility criteria are often in a centralized location without background specific to the discipline they're requiring. So it's important that you understand that they need as much information as possible. So if the word doesn't have plant in it in describing the course, it may be questionable to them. So I think it's really important to present to your materials something that is descriptive. And I'll get into that a little bit more. I think I'm getting ahead of myself. So I mentioned before, I don't know if I mentioned it, but on one of the slides it said that a biological evaluation must be completed by a journey level botanist. And that's something that's cited in the Forest Service manual. And it's pretty vague, but typically a journey level botanist is distinguished from entry level positions by their capability to independently conduct complex investigations, perform risk assessments, BEs, and provide management activity guidelines for sensitive species. And that's generally thought to be a GS9 or above. So I just threw up here some of the general schedule or GS grades where you may see the 0430 series or the professional botany series. But those that are considered journey level are typically the GS9 or 11s. And there's various ways to qualify, but this just shows you that some of the criteria used to evaluate your eligibility for those grades is based on education and experience or a combination of both. Okay, so as I was saying, these human resource personnel, they're not tied to the local unit. Matter of fact, they may not even be conferring with the hiring manager. They are making the first cut independently using criteria that they have available. So when they're looking through whether or not your course requirements are satisfied and there's any question, they're going to probably weigh towards the side of not qualified. I know personally some folks that have undergone a rigorous process of refuting what was deemed unqualified. So what I strongly recommend now to all folks is that in your application materials, you include a crosswalk. Here's a simple example. This isn't one specific to botany, but this is an individual who put in a beautiful table what discipline or series they have, the classes with parentheses of the course credits, and the total of that series so that the human resources person can simply go through that list, cross-reference it with the transcripts, and come up with a determination. It takes out a little bit of the guesswork, and I think helps them understand where maybe their background wouldn't lend to it. So I think it's an important way to enhance your eligibility and make it a little bit more clear and concise. And lastly, I caution, and I know it may be too late for some, but keep your syllabi, keep every documentation from that class that you received, because if you do go through a process where you want to challenge or move up the chain and ask it to be reevaluated by another person, because there's always that possibility, you have to generate more documentation. And I have known people who've gone through this process and have been able to argue their eligibility or prove it, so to speak. by having that syllabus. So that's really important piece of information. There are other series, and I won't go into a lot of that, but this one here highlights that this individual may actually be qualifying for an ecologist series depending on the job. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that. USAjobs.gov is the website for all federal employment. Recently, a new 2-page minimum, or maximum, I should say, has been placed on resumes, which creates a big challenge, I think, especially with some of these career series where you are trying to become eligible or qualify for a position that has a combination of experience and academic degree seeking time. So there's a lot of guidance online for how to be clear and concise with these new page limit requirements. But just a few bullet points here. They do specify you can't get your font size any smaller than 10. And the margins can't be any less than 1/2 inch. Yeah, and I've had folks that have used Publisher, which is a nice Microsoft tool to allow you to be more creative about how to structure that outside of Word. But Word does have the columns feature, and creating a little bit more condensed resume may be helpful in achieving that 2-page minimum. And then lastly on here, it's really important when human resources is calculating your eligibility, you have to have so much experience, and they're actually quantifying that experience in terms of how many hours you work and the duration you worked that job. So if you say part-time and you don't designate how many hours a week that job entailed, they're not going to be really able to quantify your experience as well, and they may underestimate to be on the side of caution. So it's important that you outline how many hours a week that job entailed and the duration that you held the position. Okay, and when I was actively job seeking, I had this puppy turned on and I had several keywords. I was trying for all of it. And sometimes jobs will be flown and the window of application can be so reduced. If you go out of town, you may miss it. So it's not uncommon for those also to be closed after they get so many applicants. So the sooner you know and the sooner you are on there, the sooner you can apply and be among the pool of candidates that's actually evaluated and transferred to the hiring manager after deemed qualified. Okay, so I added some curriculum recommendations, and some of these were classes that I took and I have found incredibly useful in what I do now. And some of these are classes that I wish I had not avoided, particularly the first bullet. When I started at the Boise, I had spent a lot of time as a tech in the field a lot, so I didn't have the background in environmental policy and planning. And even in graduate school, I cruised over to the more interesting topics like, I don't know, mycology, paleobotany. I didn't want to take, environmental policy and planning, but I had a strong learning curve when I first started because of that. So I recommend gaining familiarity with law, with policy, because it's going to be a huge part of the job that you'll do as an agency botanist. And then others here, entomology, soil science, fire ecology, etc. And then, of course, volunteer at herbaria. It's a really great place to gain taxonomy experience and to help with what could be a backlog. And staring at a microscope for hours at a time is some of the funnest and best ways to spend your time. I don't know about you, but I really enjoyed it. There's so many kinds of hair, kind of an interesting thing. Plant hair is so diverse. Anyway, so I recommend that if you are looking to gain more taxonomy experience, especially if the university or college you attend doesn't have a taxonomy course, which unfortunately is becoming more common. Okay, and I wanted to make a plug for the nurseries, pun intended. So we have several Forest Service nurseries and seed extractories that help facilitate grow outs for reforestation and for shrubland and forbs and other species that we're putting out there. We have several series of those positions, and right now there's a lot of vacant positions in the nursery realm. And eventually they anticipate filling those positions. So FYI, these are jobs that may become available in the near future, locally and at other nurseries across our system. Horticulturists, plant biologists, biological scientists, bioscience techs, and the tractor operator. So these are different series with different eligibility requirements. So if you're interested, I check out OPM for further information on how to meet those requirements. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the other avenues for getting into the federal service. There are so many different routes that you can take as a youth to get into service and also to gain what's called hiring authorities, which if you qualify and you meet the requirements, you could have a non-competitive hiring authority depending on the vehicle that you take to get into the programs. And it is a really useful tool to have because sometimes getting the eligibility requirements met to even qualify for applying for a job can be difficult. So having this in your backup plan or spreading the word with youth to let them know that there's ways to engage actively with land management and getting out there. And now more than ever, I think we need that. Leave the technology behind, come work on trails projects and, you know, get your feet dirty, get your hands dirty and get out on the land and understand there's different career paths available. We've had resource assistants on the Boise National Forest who came from academia, were recent graduates, and they've really contributed to our programs of work, and it has been a really cool thing to see. And so keep an eye out in the years to come for those opportunities and spread the word. Okay, and lastly, conclusions and questions. I haven't used AI much, but I decided after compiling the talk to make sure I covered all my bases. So I took my position description, which is actually just a rudimentary description of what I do, what's required in my job. I plugged it into our Microsoft Copilot, which is the AI that we are authorized to use. And it spat out these different categories of what a forest service botanist does. And I thought it did pretty good. There were some misspellings I had to recompute, which surprised me. But overall, it did a really good job. So protects native and rare plants, supports environmental review, trains and collaborates, conducts field surveys and monitoring, guides land management decisions, works both in the office and the field. Yeah, in a nutshell, that sums it up. Okay, and with that, I will open the floor for any questions, and I thank you for your time and attention.